All right. Phoebe Camilletti. I think I might have messed that up because I was worried about it, but nevertheless, there's the spelling. Thank you for being here. You are at least a writer, painter, poet, photographer, model, dancer, musician.
Yeah. Yeah.
What are some of the ways that you see artistic modalities connecting?
Ooh, what a great question to kick us off. So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. Any opportunity that I get to talk about creativity, especially in this kind of holistic way that you're setting the stage with, is extremely exciting to me. So, the interconnectivity of different creative modalities is something that I'm absolutely obsessed with intellectually, as well as, of course, in practice. And I feel like one of our limitations, really, as human beings, regardless of whether we identify ourselves with a creative label or we don't, is we tend to think that the interconnectivity of things doesn't really exist. But for me, with my evolution as an artist, the way that my life has been lived, to me, it doesn't make sense for these things to not be interrelated. I see all of them just as an expression of myself. I don't see the dancing as such. I don't see the painting as such. I just see them all as this outgrowth of identity. And so I think that that's one of the different ways that I like to help people play with the idea of creativity for themselves. The idea of it's just you. It's not you looking like an artist and whatever that means for society or whatever that means for that modality. It's more so what you show up as. And that just happens to have a paintbrush in its hand, or that just happens to have this piece that was produced. So to me, it's much more a human identity is what I'm kind of arriving at. And that's one way that I look at that connectivity because it's all just me. It's like one day if I want to dance, okay, then I dance. If one day I want to paint, then that's what I do. But it all comes back to me at the end of the day. So it's less so about attaching myself or anchoring myself to a label as it is allowing that label kind of as a vehicle for this larger construct of self.
Hmm. Maybe that's why when we go to school, we learn how to stand in line and do what we're told.
Mhm.
And from the kindergarten, or maybe even sometimes before that, with the idea that it's to move people efficiently from one place to another, but really it's whether it's meant to or not, it crushes the creativity of the kid because
Yeah.
you want them to think a certain way. So you're trying to say, no, this is how you think about this. This is how you think about that.
Mhm.
So maybe we all start off understanding that it's all connected because we just mix everything together. If you're a kid and you're playing whatever, you can be playing outside 1 minute and then decide to do some artwork the next, or it, it's just one big thing instead of a bunch of separate things.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. And I really like how you started what you said with the idea of kind of lining up. You referenced the idea of lines because that's exactly, I think, one of the limitations of school. So, regardless of whether or not we want to say like it boxes you in whatever ways, which is true, I think that one of the real pitfalls of the educational system in our society is the linear thinking that is basically the gold standard of pretty much everything that we do. Every single modality, whether the modality is math, whether it is something more so creative, it's all linear thinking. So there's very little emphasis that's put on thinking outside the box, critical thinking in different ways, different opportunities for us to really explore what that means for us as individuals, as well as what that means in groups, like group projects in school. There's just very little opportunity for any of that. So to come back to the idea of the line that you put out there, which is again great. I love that you said that. Um, we're following the lines. And yeah, maybe as kids we do have much more liberty to just kind of mess around and do whatever we want because there's nothing that's constraining us as a responsibility. There's nothing constraining us as an ideology that says to be an adult, to be a professional, you must look like this, even if there's some wiggle room there. So as a kid, you are just kind of proceeding through your experience and you get to grab at whatever along the way feels good. But at the same time, of course, you're experiencing the school system where little by little, I do believe that even if you're being rampantly creative in your life as a kid, as you should be, I think that you're being boxed in terms of your thought process. I think that your ability to think, because I think that everyone has a profound ability to be a critical thinker, but I think that it's very much boxed in as you progress through the educational system. And I think that that is one main reason why we really struggle and suffer when it comes to this idea of seeing ourselves as creative, and when it comes to seeing the interconnectivity as you started with. I think that that's a big deal, the critical thinking and the linear thinking that we're taught in school.
I wonder if in order to live in society, if everybody was just running wild with creativity
Mm,
and nobody stood in lines or understood what it was, what would society be like? And maybe that humanity, through our limitations, we have to have some sort of refinement or direction in order to exist together,
mhm,
and maybe to exist at all, because then if we were all just, if when you're 50 years old you're still drawing your dream house with an underground sub pen and a sliding board from the third floor and a rocket ship out back, that if we all live like that, would we ever get to the point where we could accomplish anything? I don't
it's a
know. I
great
wonder if
question.
we have to break ourselves apart like that, and then life just, you hold on to those specialities or those things that maybe it's just by chance or by design or by just the sheer will of the individual, that you hold on to those specific things. And you can say, well, I'm a painter, I don't really do these other things, but I specialize in this. I mean, I could play a piano, but I prefer to paint. So yes, they're connected, but I wonder how much of that we need in order to exist. What do you think about that?
I think that that's an excellent question. And I think that you presented it in a really cool way that set the stage for me mentally, because you said kind of everyone like running around. So I instantly had this certain energetic image of what you were talking about. And I think that what you said at the end is exactly right. You said something to the effect of through sheer individual willpower. That's basically how you put it. Would we essentially differentiate ourselves? Would we essentially sort out ourselves kind of in a way that is more linear, that is more societally what we expect and what we see in this day and age? I think the answer is yes. I think that if we had that abundance of opportunity in every sense, whether that means like opportunity came to us as a societal narrative, whether that means that we allowed ourselves permission individually to be rampantly creative, I do think that we would all more so gravitate eventually down to maybe one, two, three, four. I could just list numbers, whatever number of modalities that we would more see. Okay, like this is true for me. I find that this modality resonates more with me than this one. I am a painter. I am not an architect. I am a violinist. I am not a model, right? I do think that that natural sorting would occur. So to me, I guess my impression is I feel like our society would still gain structure. I don't think it would ultimately be a situation where we are chaotically creative. I think that having more so, though, of an understanding that that is an available option to us, and it's more so accepted that that's a human process that everyone goes through, not just in childhood, but perhaps also into college, perhaps also into the start of your adult life as a professional. And then maybe that's when you start to more so figure out, but I think we're kind of forced out of it in childhood. So again, to come back to your original thought, I do think that society would kind of naturally organize itself, perhaps. Maybe it wouldn't look like how it does now. I don't think it would. I think it would be a little bit more um, abundantly creative, or a lot more abundantly creative. But I think we'd have more time to explore and to arrive at what we truly feel resonates with us in a sincere way. I think there would just be more opportunity for that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it does come down to the time. That's the big element. And that's whether it's real or not, it's the perception of humanity that there is such thing as time. So it's one of the limits of humanity. I think if you knew you would live to be 1,000 years old, then maybe you would do things differently.
Right. Right.
But I think even then, people say it even now. I don't have time to do that. I don't. You're too busy chasing being the human living in society, getting those things that you need. That a society couldn't afford everyone to be creative to the point where they just will sacrifice everything for their art
Mm-hmm.
or for creativity.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the outliers like that. It's more of I can't think of the word, but it's more of a luxury for
Right.
humanity to be
Right.
able to have the artistic side. And I think everybody connects with it to a point,
Mm-hmm.
because you could be a mathematician lost in numbers all the time, but you're going to see a picture somewhere, whether it's in a natural occurring scene or somebody painted it, and connect with it somehow, or you're going
Yeah.
to hear music and connect with it somehow.
Mm-hmm.
So where do you think creativity comes from?
Well, I want to touch on two things you said, and then I'll cycle back to that quickly, if that's okay. I really like how
Okay.
you started what you said with the idea of time and how essentially that's a construct. And a lot of how we express ourselves in the world does come down to that linear view of time as such, right? Because I've been thinking a lot recently about different interpretations of time, different ways of processing time, different ways of positioning ourselves as being more so creators of time and or in control of time versus we are victims of time. So that's one interesting thing that you said.
Mhm.
And then you said something that I really liked about, oh yeah, you mentioned kind of like different fields and how there was this idea given to us of how maybe we can't just treat creativity as a luxury, right? Because we have these practical things that we have to attend to. And so I guess touching on that briefly is one way of getting to your question. But I'd like to say that one of the things that I'm really interested in is different ways that we can, in fact, see pretty much anything that we do as creative. And when we allow that, when we give ourselves permission to see things that we do as creative because we are creators by sheer act alone of being alive, that can open up a lot of space for aspects of identity, for aspects of evolution, for aspects of expansion that maybe we weren't letting ourselves see. Maybe we weren't letting ourselves access those parts of ourselves because we had, in fact, repressed them under whatever belief systems are linked to the idea that math is not creative, the idea that engineering is not creative, the idea that being a lawyer is not creative, whatever it is. I could go on forever, right? But when we kind of suppress our intrinsic creativity because we don't see things a certain way. I just think that's so interesting as like an avenue for opening up different layers and levels of ourselves and our expansion. But now I've forgotten your question. I apologize. What was your question?
So, so then having all that, the original question was, where does creativity come from? I think
All right.
you'd have to define creativity and say creativity is just thought, really. I mean,
Oh,
eventually you get so broad, there's nothing to hold on to. But I think if you answer where does thought come from, then you've also answered where does creativity come from.
mm, I like that. If you've answered where does thought come from, you've answered where does creativity come from. I think that that's definitely a very interesting way of seeing it because I like it in the sense that every single thought that we have is generative. Every single thought that we have is creative because for the thought to exist, that of course is creative. It came from somewhere, right? It's a
Mhm.
generative thought. Regardless of whether we see a thought as inhibitory or we don't like it or we try to distance ourselves from it or whatever, right? So I really like the idea of thought as being one way of interpreting the basis of creativity. I think that another way would just be by, and I made reference to this before, I think, by being alive, you are essentially in a position as a creationist. We don't see it that way, but you are constructing your life story with every breath that you take, right? And we tend to think that that's romanticized as an idea, I think, or we tend to kind of say, like, okay, sure, maybe. but there are all of these XYZ forces that are outside of me. And what do you say about that? Everything is being co-created. My talking to you right now is creating an experience. I am having an impression on you. You're having an impression on me. This is now, when this is produced, this is going to have an impression on multiple people who hear this, regardless of what the impression is. Every single thing that we're doing is creating some kind of reaction. It's creating some kind of circumstance. So what I interested in is this idea of how can we unpack that, and how can we use that as a sense and source of empowerment for ourselves? Because at the end of the day, that's what it's about. Like, are you living the life that you want to lead? No? Okay. So what tools can we look at that are going to resonate or not resonate with you until you find something that does inspire you? And hey, maybe that thing that inspires you will be a way of interpreting creativity. Because guess what? As a kid, you probably wanted to play the tuba. As a kid, you probably wanted to, I don't know, be in a gallery somewhere. Like all of these dreams. And I know we all like talk about it like, oh, childhood dreams, like great, but they're still part of you. Like they didn't go anywhere. You didn't just give up this idea that you could be on a world stage somewhere. It's still there. You just convinced yourself that it's not there. But how can you use that? Because it's part of you. So to come back to your question, like another way that I think of interpreting like where creativity comes from, I think it's also on a soul level. I think it's also just on a beingness level. So the mind is absolutely correct, but also I just think it's foundational to the totality of who we are.
So then, do you think creativity is a mixture of things that we manifest ourselves through thought and experience?
Yeah.
And also, is it something, it's obviously something outside of us, whether it's ethereal or just knowledge. There's things we don't know. So if
Right.
we learn things, read a book, learn something we didn't know, then that adds to how we think.
Yeah. I think
So then, is there a force outside of us, like this entity of creativity, or this place where creativity lives when we're not thinking about it? Like, is if we're not connected with it on the modality of some sort of art where you're tapping into the creative music, the creative painting, the creative writing, that is that piece of creativity that is all connected, but is that piece of it sitting somewhere waiting to connect with us, or is it just out there?
I really like this question, and I appreciate this question because this might allow us to get into more abstract territory potentially. So I think that the short answer is yes. I mean, I believe that we are all conscious of whatever is beyond us in the way that you're talking about. So some people call it God, some people call it energy, some people call it circumstance, some people call it chance, some people call it destiny. There are so many different words, I think, that we can and should use to describe what is essentially the same thing, aka what we perceive as being kind of beyond us or outside us, or even another way by extension, I think is things that we feel like are not in our control, things that we feel are not within us, not within our locus of power. So again, just different ways of saying what I think is all kind of the same thing, depending on how you look at it. So your question of like, does creativity exist there, as presented? I think the answer is yes, because I see creativity as kind of a co-creation process. So it is the things that you have control over. I can pick up my paintbrush. Okay, I can devote 10 minutes to something. Those are things that I can choose to control. But it's also the energetic forces and the circumstantial forces, could be one and the same depending on how you look at it, that will exist and be influenced by, as well as will influence you in that process. So I think it comes to, I think a large part of creativity is contingent on that respect for the fact that you are not completely in control, and that can be an empowering thing because there are circumstances beyond you. And some people, a lot of people, I think, tend to look at that with a sense of disillusionment and disempowerment, which I completely respect. I understand how frustrating it can be when you don't feel like you're in control of your life or your circumstances. But the more I think that you can approach that with a sense of curiosity, again, however you want to label it, energy, God, whatever, the more that you can approach that with curiosity, even if you don't necessarily believe that there are things outside of you. Um, Again, curiosity I think can be very generative in and of itself. I think it can be very creative just to have a curiosity. So, is curiosity essential to creativity? Yes. Is creativity waiting beyond us somewhere? To an extent, yeah. But I think we need to show up as creators ourselves and fully embody that as an experience for the creativity that's outside of us, so to speak, to engage with us. So that is part of the co-creative process as well.
So then what are some ways that you have found to connect with certain types of creative forces?
Hmm. I like this question a lot. I think that for me, one of the main ways that I've inspired creatively, there we go. One of the main ways that I'm inspired creatively is, this is going to sound trite, so I'll try to explain it. Just by being alive, by being engaged in the world. So sometimes it's reading a poem and I just have this rush of ideas and emotion and I can't stop myself from writing things down. Sometimes it's listening to a song or even just like a clip of a song, like on an ad, like the most random thing, and then that gets me going on a certain thought process. So my first response to your question is, for me, a lot of it is just showing up authentically in the world and allowing myself to engage with the material that's already out there and having this real openness of perspective and openness of emotion to it, instead of um shutting myself down because maybe I'm tired or maybe like I don't feel good, on any given day, trying to just show up as openly as I can to the experience that's life. That is my creative wellspring at the end of the day. It's just being connected to people, it's being connected to ideas, and it's trying my best to not let any experience pass me by. So to really try to be grounded in this conversation that I'm having with you, in trying to be grounded in some uncomfortable sensation. Like maybe I'm at the gym and I'm doing reps and it really doesn't feel good, but I'm still trying to be present in that experience. Because when you're present in an experience, I don't care how mundane it is, I don't care how uncomfortable it is. I think that that is a deep, deep source of creativity. And I think people would be surprised if they really open themselves to the idea of what being present could mean just as you move through life, versus like it has to look like a meditative process or whatever we've been told. Just really grounding into that. That is where creativity most comes from for me.
Yeah, the presentness, I feel like it does get overused in explanation.
Yeah.
Really, it, but it's the right word,
Mhm.
and it's maybe observing is a good one too, where you just be there and
Mhm.
see quote unquote, and then also feel, use all those senses to engage with it.
Mhm.
I've heard a good explanation of past, present, and future, that it's like an hourglass, and you can look in
Mm.
the top, and there's the past, or at the bottom there's the past, and then you can't get to it. It's just there. You can see it. And then the future you can imagine, that's at the top, but the present is the part where the sand is falling through.
Oh, I like that.
And it only lasts that little split second of the falling through. But you have all those people that are saying, or all the people, the idea of living in the present and observing that there is such a thing as the past and future. I think there's some people that think there isn't,
Right.
but I think there is. There must be,
Right.
because what's memory and what's hope, and then you have that little part that everybody's trying to grab onto. You're trying to live that little in that presence of right there. But it's a thing I need to think about a lot more. I'm not, it doesn't feel right to say I'm just living for that little part that's falling through, because
Right.
I think you're living for all of it. But it's an
Right.
interesting picture to cogitate on as far as being present and observing.
Oh
When
yeah.
I when I
Go ahead.
hear about or think about being present, I think about observing too. So I think about pictures or nature or like a painting. If you're somewhere and you're looking at it, so you look at the whole painting that you can see, and then you just focus down on a really small part, and then you observe things that you wouldn't normally observe. And I
Mhm.
think that's the motif for life, is that you can think that there's not much going on in this 1 square inch of painting, but you can see the brushstroke, you can see the whether it's acrylic or oil and the different way that interacts with our understanding of physics or reality. And then you can back up and see the total picture as presented. But even then, you can also imagine what it would look like if the picture kept out more, and you could back up even more and more and more. And I think that's what living is
Mhm.
you start out in front of this picture, and then as time goes by, the way we experience it, you start to see more and more of that bigger picture. And that's why you have those maybe platitudes of, time heals everything. It doesn't really heal everything, it just makes it less focused. So you see the bigger picture, the actual bigger picture, as you get farther and farther from something.
I really like what you just said. What I really like about it is how you connected time as an hourglass, as you kind of like described it, and you related that to the experience of looking at a picture. I just like those two ideas in my mind coming together. And I think that one place I'd like to go with what you said is the idea that I think that's why a lot of people are resistant to life and resistant to creativity. It's because when we're thinking of things in this kind of like, so you said hourglass. I like the spherical idea of the hourglass, like the parts of the hourglass where it's spherical. Because that's kind of more so my interpretation of time versus like a linear progression. But to join that with what I'm trying to say, I think that people get caught up in the idea that there's so many ways to interpret life. There's so many different ways to interpret art, and they kind of use that as one of the bases of thinking art's not for me, or like, whatever modality creatively, that's not for me. A lot of people get frustrated and hung up when you tell them there's no one way to interpret something, or like it's kind of whatever you want. Because I think in part, school, the education system has kind of told us there's a certain way to do things. And that's one reason why I think a lot of people gravitate more so toward math or science, because they like that linearity of thinking more so. I'm not saying it's totally linear, but they like having things kind of put in boxes. So when you're looking at a painting, let's say I did focus on the 1 square inch down here versus here, a lot of people would kind of be like, "Oh, like why are you looking there? I didn't know I was supposed to look there. I thought I was supposed to look there." Like, "What do you mean? Like it means that?" It's like, "No, it doesn't mean anything." Like when you develop your own basis for critical thinking, when you develop your own identity as a person, you get to determine for yourself what the painting means. You get to look down at the bottom or look up at the top. You get to authentically, from a place of sincerity, decide, what does that painting mean to you? What does your life mean to you? What does the experience that you want to cultivate for yourself and for other people mean to you? And when you're able to deepen into that, I think, is when that spherical idea of time comes a little bit more full circle, no pun intended. Because I think one thing that you said that stands out to me also is you mentioned like the grain falling through, and I hear you on that. And but you said grab like a grain. That's what you said. You used the word grab, like as like a singular moment. And I think that's how a lot of people, practically speaking, look at time. I know that I struggle with that too. But what if there's nothing to grab? What if it's just we are kind of like coming through time and time is coming through us? There's nothing that we have to do. There's no thing that we have to seize the way that we think that we do. Instead, it's more just this deepening of understanding of who we are and how that relates to the world around us. So there's nothing to chase. there is nothing that we're doing wrong or right. It's just the situationality of when you fully feel like you're present in the moment within the kind of the sphere of our lives, because everything comes full circle. Everything comes full circle in our lives. I think that's when you can really understand there is no right way to interpret the painting. There's no right way to make the painting. There's no right way to make your life. And I know it's hard to accept. I really, really do. But that's what I believe.
It comes down to that individual interpretation. For whatever reason, we all have our own perspective.
Right.
And I like the idea, just as far as existence goes, is that's why we're all here, is just to experience things from our own perspective. That
Mm-hmm.
whether you want to go with maybe some would call a more heretical view of together we're all one.
Mm-hmm.
I like that idea. It explains a lot to me that if you were an all powerful being or entity, that maybe you couldn't experience things like a person could. And that seems like a paradox, because if you're all powerful and you can do everything, you should be able to experience things like a person could. But then maybe that's what the all powerful thing is doing through us, is our experience. And we live however life lives, whether it's the grains of sand or time as a disc and all of that, that we're experiencing all of that, so we can then in the end, or at some point, be all one again and have all the perspectives gained of all these lives, and all the pain and joy of living is realized by everyone. Because if you were all powerful, you wouldn't necessarily fear things like people fear. Like, that's a thing I don't think you could feel.
Right.
But if you divided yourself up into however many people there are, or life forces or whatever, then maybe you'd have a perspective on it. So maybe we are all perspectives. But
Yeah.
I like your idea of the time being a sphere. I think I've heard before time is a disc, and I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember where I heard it. And then I thought about it a lot, and it makes sense to me that it's like a record where in your mind, you could go to any point of that. You could think about what it's going to be like in the future, and maybe it will be, and maybe it won't. You can remember the past, and maybe you're correct in your memories, or maybe they're skewed. But it's all like picking up the needle and just going along that disc of time.
Right.
So
Right. No, I love that. I think the record is a cool way of bringing your disc idea back, and it's still, obviously the circle concept and the spherical idea in a certain sense. I think I think that there's so much here for people to think about. There's so much here for me to think about. Because for one thing, I mean, you made brief reference kind of to like looking back at the past, right? Like, what if people more so could embrace this idea that, sure, the past like happened, but that doesn't mean that your interpretation of the past has to be the way that you think it has to be. It doesn't mean that it has to be what it is now. Even if you feel like you're at peace with the past, it doesn't have to be what it is now. And I would suggest kind of that it's a creative activity, a deeply creative activity, to look at these different pieces of your life and to apply the kind of perspective to them that is going to make you into more so of who you want to show up in the world as. What's more creative than that? To look at your life and to understand that it's your life, so you have the say of what the past meant, what happened in the past. Of course, to an extent, like you can't change the past, things happened. No one's denying that. But it's how you interpret it that means everything. So, this idea of reevaluating, I think, our life circumstances and our belief system, because that's one thing I wanted to touch on based on what you said. And it relates perfectly to this idea of the past. Like, how are we sculpting our belief systems? Are we doing it from an active place? And what made me think of to say this is you mentioned the idea of like, if we move on past this life or however you conceptualized it, being without fear. That's what you said. And what I wanted to say is you and I and everyone listening, we all know that there are all of these beliefs that we could access at any time. Like to treat fear this way, you can do anything if you really set your mind to it. Like, this is what reevaluating the past would look like. So we're in this like um cacophony. We're in this sea of belief systems, but we don't really believe that some of them are for us. Like, oh, like to live fearlessly, like, yeah, that's for other people. Like, I get that they can do it, but there's whatever about you and your beliefs that's making you feel like you couldn't operate from a place of fearlessness or whatever you want to call it. But you can. And that is an ideally creative thing, to examine your belief system, to decide, you know what? Maybe I'm going to be afraid, but I'm going to embrace fear as a friend, because that's going to allow me to go somewhere with my life that I wasn't able to go before. So that's just another way of interpreting creativity. It's like, how do you galvanize, how do you recreate your personal belief system, whether it's about time, whether it's about emotion, whatever it is? How can you embrace that as a creative act that allows you to show up in your life that the way that you want to? It's fascinating to me.
Yeah, I feel like because of the limits of humanity, where we only have this certain amount of time here, it seems that you could spend all your time reinventing yourself and going in all those different directions, and then life is over. Now, would that be a life fulfilled? I mean, maybe it would be. Maybe that's closer to the idea of a society where everybody's just running wild in art. They're just doing everything. And I don't know if maybe that exists somewhere else, some other program, if you believe we're in a simulation or what. But maybe life as we're experiencing it now, maybe it is the focused down to concentrate on the 1 square inch, the figurative 1 square inch of something, to where we're put in these bodies and these limits, to where we do think we only have a certain amount of time. So I'm going to try to do this, this, and this. I have these things I want to do. And then we end up in these specialities or in a job or whatever, that you get locked in.
Yeah.
That certainly you could get out of, but you feel locked in because you're just like, well, this is just what I'm doing this time.
Right.
And maybe there's more and maybe there isn't. Maybe it's just a long dreamless sleep after, or maybe you do this over again a different way, or something completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. I like how you said all of that. I think that it's such an individual thing, because coming back to me just as an example, you listed a beautiful laundry list of things that I do. Like, I'm a poet, I'm an artist, as a painter, I'm also a photographer, like all of these modalities, right? That's for me. That's what I understand in my highest sense of self to be expansive for me. Now let's look at someone else who is just a painter. Does that mean that they are not expansive in the same way that I am? No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means, probably, hopefully, is that they've found their expansion through that one modality. That is what they consider to be rich and abundant. For me, my very nature is that I want to be engaged in everything, because I see it as all related, and I have proficiency in these different areas, and I find learning in all of these different areas. But I say this to say that I think that when we really work to understand ourselves, because it's work, it's a process. You don't just understand yourself one day and you're done, obviously. It's an ongoing life process. But when we commit to loving and understanding ourselves, that's when we get to decide, okay, do I want to do all of these different things, creative things, whatever things, or do I want to focus? And then the beautiful thing, I believe, is that life tells you if that's right for you or not. You feel it. If you're painting only and you feel stuck, you feel depressed, you feel these sensations that maybe you can't even name, you will eventually move beyond that in some way. You will explore in some way. It's just the nature of life to do that. Whereas, me over here, I'm exploring in all of these different senses. And if I feel trapped, if I feel stuck, that's how I know it's time to kind of maybe move to the next level or try something new within one of these modalities. So life is giving us the experiences, and that's part of like the co-creating part, I think. When we do, more is given to us to do and to learn. And so it's just all this cyclical process. So I think that, expansion and growth and identifying as creative can take any form. And in fact, not to tangent this too much, but I think that one of the real hurdles that we run up against is because, or is that rather, we compare ourselves to other people being creative, even if we just do it subconsciously. And like, oh, they're doing it this way. Like maybe that means I'm not really an artist. Maybe that means that I'm not really this. Maybe I'm doing it wrong. And we don't think these thoughts consciously, but we take them into our identity. So a painter is no different than this person is no different than this person, except you are different. You're just all part of the collective of creativity, to put it a certain way.
It's a lot to think about. I
know.
agree.
It is a lot to think about.
It reminds me of the military when I've seen this in a movie too, in a different way, but I can't remember which one came first for me. But the military, when the drill instructor puts you in charge, like says you're going to be the guide, which is the person that carries the guide on and is at the front of the platoon. He goes, okay, you're going to be the guide until I find somebody better. So I wonder if that's how you, in your mind, can encapsulate art or your pursuits in life, where you think, I'm going to do this until I find something better. And that might be a more of a pessimistic way of looking at it, but I think it gets you to the same place, which is, while I'm satisfied and searching in this direction, I'm going to keep doing it because this is the best thing going right now, I think. And then if I see something else along the way, I'm going to go to that. There's so many different ways to go about in that conversation of, if you see something else, do you then break off and do that at the risk of losing the thing you like, and then you can come back to it later? Or do you try to do both? Or do you then realize that you can't do both with the energy that you could with just doing one? So you'd rather focus on one than the other. But I think that comes back to the whole individual pursuit, the whole individual, what the person prefers.
Agreed. And I think that you just gave us a really interesting framing to talk about the idea of like, I'll do this until whatever better, emerges. And I think that at the very core, perhaps that is useful for people in the sense that I think that so many people stop themselves from even starting right before they start, like, so to speak. There's this idea of like what momentum or like doing something should look like. Like, I'm not a painter. Like, I keep saying painting is like my example here, but that's fine. Like, I'm not a painter. Like, why would I? Like, I wouldn't own a canvas. Why would I pick up a paintbrush? Like, I'm not a painter. Okay, but don't you want to be? Don't you have this dream, which is why you're even thinking these thoughts? Okay, so make a painting, right? It doesn't have to look good. It doesn't have to be anything. Just make a painting. So if we embrace your idea of like just do something until like whatever better, I think that's great in the sense of at least you're in the momentum. You're doing something better, abstract, whatever. Let it be abstract. But that idea of doing something, I think, is really, 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 really important. I think the only issue would be like what truly is better, right? But it doesn't even have to necessarily be that word. It could just be like, I'm going to do this until the next evolution presents itself or the next thing presents itself or whatever. And I like that especially as a framing because one reason I'm speaking to you and one reason I'm putting more so my artistic identity out there is because I want to inspire people to believe that it can look messy. It can look like you're a billion different things. Like, I think that there's this very accepted idea of like, maybe you get like 4 labels for yourself max, like in life, like for some reason, like I'm a father, I'm an artist, I'm an engineer, I am a writer, right? Like, okay, that's fine. For some people, that's fine because they do want to focus on those areas like we were talking about. But for me, it would be compressive to have just those labels for myself. So part of what I'm hoping to do is to show people that if you do want to have all of these identities and all of these labels, that's okay too. Like it's all okay. There's no right, there's no wrong. So anyway, doing something until you find the better thing, yes, just get started. Like let yourself do the thing that for whatever reason you don't feel like you can do because you can. That's why you've had the thought to do it. It's because you want to do it. So the next step is just taking action and then the rest will follow.
Yeah, it is amazing how we assign meanings to things. Like these two things aren't really related, but the idea that when you say artist, I think you and I probably picture the same thing, which is a person with a paintbrush. That's just because that's how we learn that for whatever reason.
Right.
I mean, you can see the art in everything, but that is what I think about. And it's probably, if I expand on that picture, they're wearing a beret, they have the palette, there's a easel in front of them, and the paintbrush is up. That's how
Right.
if somebody says artist, that's what I think of.
Right.
That's why you have to put other names in front of it, because I think most people think like that. You say musical artist. Oh, okay. And these other things. But when we assign something a word or we explain it in a certain way, it definitely affects how we think about it. So if I were to say, I'm going to do this artistic pursuit until I find something better, it does sound pessimistic and like less than ideal. Like there seems like you should be, that shouldn't be the reason you're doing that. You should be doing that because that's what you want to do.
Yeah.
But that is what I'm saying. It's just presenting it in a different light. So
Mhm.
it's the art of words. Okay.
Yeah.
What what type of modality do you find you can connect with the easiest? Like if,
Writing. Go
okay.
ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Writing.
Yeah.
I agree. Writing, when you say writing, there's so many different parts of it, but because poetry I would include in writing, obviously, but it's for me, I do like writing. And if somebody were to say, what do you do? I would say, I'm a writer.
Mhm.
Now, I only feel like that if I write that day or have written recently enough to be able to say I did it. So that's one of the draws of going to write is you sit down, you show up, you write something, whether you're going for a topic, a time, or a word count. You've done something so you can say to yourself through however you see it
Mhm.
that that's what you are. That's how you're identifying yourself that day. So
Mhm.
sometimes I'll say, today I'm a writer, or today I was a poet.
Mm.
And it's, I mean, I think you're both writing in both of those things. But for me, poetry is a different connection to a different piece of creativity than writing a science fiction book is. I don't think one's any better than the other, but as far as connecting with it, for whatever reason, for the last 2 or 3 years, I think poetry is the easiest thing for me to connect with, to that creative spirit
Yeah.
that I used to worry. I'm going to write, I'm going to try to do this poetry book, and then I'm not going to be able to do a poetry book again. I'm going to run out of thoughts on that, and that's just going to be over.
Right.
And then you finish the one and you try to move on to something else the next year, and then the poetry is still there.
Mhm.
And I started visualizing, where do I think that comes from? What am I connecting with when I get into that zone or state of mind for poetry? And I definitely visualize it as a place, and I feel like it's always there. It's
Mm.
always waiting to a point. Like, I think if you ignore it long enough, then it starts to go, oh, it's like, okay, I guess you don't want to interact. So it goes and does something else,
Right.
whether that's connecting with someone else, doing something else on its own, whatever. But I feel like now that I've shown up long enough that it expects me to be there.
Mm,
So it's always there waiting. And it's like, hey, what do you think about this? And it throws a line out. And then because I'm a writer and writers write, whatever you're doing, you have to stop and write that down. And normally, if I write a line down, I'll date it and put a time by it just to keep it straight in my linear mind, even though I think it's on a disc, that I can go back to it and see the growth of it or attach it to other thoughts, because you end up with a whole bunch of different phrases or things that you have to then go through if you let them pile up and separate them and go, okay, this is dialogue for a story somewhere else. This is
right,
poetry, and
right.
this poetry belongs with this poem, and this one with that one, or this is an essay, or this is an idea for a painting.
Mhm.
So it's, do you have a modality that you've found easier to connect with?
There's just so many little great nuggets in what you said. Honestly, I just have to touch on some of them. I perhaps most like how you acknowledged that it's a place. You said it's a place that I can visualize and it's waiting for me, right? And it will throw a line out, and essentially like it's up to me whether I grab that line or not is the implied idea there. But I love this idea of you actively having a visualization process of it being like a place that you go to. And that gives me more understanding of one of your questions like half an hour ago about kind of like, is creativity outside of us? Is it like a place kind of? And so I can see more so how you frame that for yourself. And I would just link that back to what we were talking about for like the kind of co-creative process. So whether that means it's like a space that you visualize as outside of yourself, or whether that means that it's a label that you've given to yourself, because that's kind of outside you too. It's like a label that you're stamping on yourself. Because that reminds me of how um, you started what you said by saying like, maybe I'm a writer today. Like, and I'm a writer only if I like work on this project, if I give myself the time to do it or something like that. And just the different ways that we decide for ourselves what criteria would mean that we can put the label on ourselves for any day or any life experience, right? I think that's very interesting, and I'm very interested in that. Um, where to go with that though? I do really like the idea of creativity as a space that you visualize. And I think that if everyone gave themselves the opportunity to have a mental space of some kind when it comes to the things that are most valuable to them, the experiences that are most valuable to them, having essentially like an opportunity to decorate a space both with like literal decor and the emotions, and just to make it a very deliberate process. I think that that opens up so much in terms of like creative territory and just life territory. It's a place where sometimes if you meditate, you can go there then. It's a place that you just know is there, like you said, even if you don't actively engage with it. But I really, really like that idea. So to come back to your question of like I forget what you said exactly, but most approachable for me as like a writing modality. Um, I feel like poetry, what you said about poetry really resonates with me. I think that poetry is such an incredible art form because I think, well, there's so many reasons why, but what's coming up for me is that poetry is something that can truly be whatever you want it to be, but it can be that thing in potentially a very short burst of time or attention. Like it's something, of course, that you can devote much time to, and you probably should. But it's something that allows you to encapsulate an emotion or an experience or a breadth of emotions and experiences in this little like kind of compact package, I guess I would say. It's kind of like slipping something into your pocket. And I think that that way of looking at it is really beautiful. And that's not the only way to look at poetry, of course. People write long poems all the time. People's poetry is very different. But I love that that's what it can be. Like if you challenged yourself, for example, let's say you're listening to this right now and you're not a poet. What if you wanted to just try to write a haiku? So it's like 5, 7, 5 syllables, pretty easy theoretically. But what if you just thought of one emotion, one experience, and you just wrote a haiku about it? It probably would take you 5 minutes or less, even if you're not a poet, even if you don't identify that way, to do that. And that just kind of encapsulates, I think, why poetry can be so accessible, why it's so interesting. So I would say my answer to your question is poetry. Yeah, I think that that's kind of like a sweet spot for me. Um, Writing novels though is so important to me. And it's so much a part of my creative construct in my imagination, in my mind. But the thing with that is it can be more laborious, it can be much more emotionally heavy. And I like the relative levity of poetry versus the gravity, so to speak, of the novel writing process. But they both can be both at the same time. So, yeah.
Okay. Do you have if it's a mental place that you go to prepare for that, or a physical place that you do most of your writing and you've set it up in a certain way to help facilitate that? How about that?
Mm. I have to say that the answer to both is actually no. And that's interesting for me to say out loud because I do think that it's a great thing for people to do in general. I guess that's just not something that really resonates with me with where I'm at right now. But I don't have any real ritualistic process surrounding writing, whether in a mental sense or in an actual physicality sense. I tend to just really kind of do a very disciplinary kind of approach to it. And I think that that's an interesting thing for us to touch on as well. The idea that I think that people see discipline implicitly as antithetical to creativity because of the image of creativity that you were
Mm.
talking about, like you said, artist, right? I think we also think creativity means chaos. It means you're undisciplined. It means that your thoughts are all over the place. It means that you're not making any money. It means that you're just subject to the whims of all of these inspirational things and you don't like hunker down and do it. When in reality, especially creatives who are more so successful commercially and in societally, they do have a very strong disciplinary vein. So for me, that's just what resonates right now. It's like I have the discipline, and sometimes that looks different. Sometimes I'm sitting at my desk like I am now. Sometimes I'm on my laptop at a cafe, but it just kind of comes down to like, how am I going to connect with the discipline that I've cultivated intentionally to be able to produce something? And I think that's an important piece of creativity, like I said, that people don't fully understand until they embody it, until they work to cultivate the discipline. That's when I think you really can deepen into creativity in a beautiful way if you choose to do that.
Hmm. Do you what kind of connections do you see with music and writing? Like, do you
Mhm.
listen to certain music when you're writing, or do you visualize music since you play the violin? Are you more in the technical end of it and you can think, "Oh, this is what this would sound like," or this is does it connect to writing at all?
For me, my mind is going a few different places, so I'll just start with what I think makes sense. My first novel is about Beethoven, essentially. It's about a spiritual, soul level interpretation of Beethoven with a haunting aspect. So essentially, Beethoven is timeless in this reality that I've created, and he is emotionally and otherwise present in my main character's reality. And so I say this to say that for me, music is this deep, deep, deep wellspring of life. Like that for me, there's not really any way of looking beyond music to interpret what life is. Like it's so linked to my identity, music. And that's why it was just like very naturally the subject of my first novel. So I think that music and writing, to come back to your question, are linked for me in the sense of the emotional vein. That's what I would say. To me, it's not so much like ideologically what's interesting. It's more so like the emotionality that I experience in music and writing. Those are very linked. So do I listen to music while I'm writing? Sometimes. Do I not? Other times? Sometimes. So to me, it's kind of like I think it just depends on where I'm at emotionally and what I feel will serve what I'm working on. So that would be like the more practical link. But again, just to go back to the emotional thing, I think it's like when you're a musician, like when you really allow that to become part of yourself, there's no getting away from it. Like So yeah, it's a huge part of my writing, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. I can listen to it sometimes, and then other times when I am listening to it, I'm like, no, I got to turn that off and focus.
Yeah.
But then I think maybe I listen to music more when I think about writing, and not think about writing as in I'm thinking about sitting somewhere and writing or typing,
Mhm.
that I think about what I am going to write. And that's less of the poetry connection and more of the prose connection or the writing connection,
Right.
where if you're writing a science fiction space drama and you're listening to some music while you run, then it takes you out of the moment of the running, the pain or discomfort of that.
Mhm.
So that it's a little bit of an emotional outlet, maybe because that energy is going into the physical work. And then your brain is free to just, I guess it's more of that creative running wildness with the music. And you try to match that up, or the right song comes on and you think about the right scene. Oftentimes I'll have scenes I'm working on for a book, and then when I hear a song that reminds me of that scene, or I start thinking about that scene, I'll write that down in the notes for it. And maybe sometimes if I don't have a chapter title yet for it, I'll just write the name of that song
Mhm.
into it.
Mhm.
So you end up kind of like an informal soundtrack to a thing. But
Yeah.
then I have a list when I'm running. If that song comes on, or a song like that, or I want to think about that scene more and play that action through, and it would have to be aggravating to anyone that wasn't involved in it, like that wasn't thinking of it. It's like listening to the same song over and over again. It's playing that same scene through your head over and over again, trying to notice that different visuals that you get, and how can you write that down so that transfers to words. So it's, I guess it's a lot like, I like your thing of saying the connection is the emotion of it, because I
Mhm.
think that's exactly what it is. So you're trying to capture that emotion in a visual, but writing it, and that's pretty amazing.
It is amazing. And it's so wild, especially for you to frame it that way, because everyone's emotional experience of music is very different, right? Like man, whew, I don't know. I feel like I don't want to slip into the wormhole here and like go too deep into this, but the thing that's great about music and difficult about music is that when you feel it on such a deeply connected emotional level, it can be hard to bring it up to the thought level, at least for me, because I feel it in such a deep part of my being. And while I am very engaged intellectually, in fact, I think that's one reason why it can be frustrating for me. It's like, okay, I know what I feel with the musical whatever, and I know what my thoughts are, but how do I create a synergistic opportunity between these two realms of being, so to speak, that is going to reach people, right? Because it's like I know what I feel and I know how I could communicate it, but where's the real authentic connection of these planes of existence that's going to make this a piece that someone will actually read and they're going to know what the heck I'm talking about? Because if I'm just here and I'm operating just from here, people are going to have no idea what the hell I'm saying. They're going to be like, okay, like so it's this idea. I think what I'm trying to say, to tie back to creativity is that process of the soul level, the authentic level, whatever words you want to use for it,
Mhm.
joined with what your thought process is, to produce something that, if it's your goal to reach people, and it doesn't always have to be, but if it is your goal to reach people, how can you understand the calibration of the authenticity for yourself, but still reach other people at the same time? To me, that's fascinating. And I think music and writing, that's a perfect way of kind of encapsulating what I'm trying to say, that it's difficult to achieve that, I think.
Yeah, that calibration I think is key there, and it makes me think about the book Isis Unveiled, which talks about the vibrations and everything of everything. And then it makes me think about religious writings where angels are singing. So there's something to that loud noises and then Gabriel's trumpet at tribulation, that it's the sound. Maybe it's a sound is a thing that we're feeling, but maybe it's the stuff we don't realize we're feeling, which is the vibrations of it. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
when you take those vibrations and you transfer them into words, whether you call vibrations emotions or whatever, you're transferring it into words, you're transforming it into a picture of why people can look at things and it resonates with them. Resonates again, back to the sound. I mean, we're all using the words and we're just not understanding that that's what it's saying, that we're all on the same. There's definitely something to the vibration of every living thing. So that's what we're speaking to. It's something we can't put into words, that we can't put into visuals, but we're just barely touching it and going, that I recognize somehow, because maybe it's part of what's more than us that we don't realize.
Yeah. I mean, I really like what you just said. I I what I'll latch onto is, you acknowledged how we say like resonate with, but we don't fully recognize what that means. That is such a trendy phrase for people to say like this resonates with me. People use it wrong. People say like a person resonates with them, but that phrase is out there. But you're so right that so many things that we do and so many ways that we use language make reference to this deeper knowing, this deeper implicit connection to sound or energy, right? Or all of these other
Mm.
things that we've kind of talked about a little bit. But we go about our lives in a state of distraction, frankly. That's what's coming up for me. It's a state of distraction. And I don't just mean like checking our phones. I don't just mean wasting time on the internet, but how are we distracting ourselves from ourselves? Like how are we allowing the beliefs that we've taken on to be a distraction from that little burning dream that we have deep within. And to come back to something that relates to music that fits what I'm saying right now, when I was in my last band for, I think it was like 3 or 4 years, the number one comment that I would get from people who would come up to me after a show was, I always wanted to play violin. Like I always wanted to play violin. Like how do you do it? Or something to that effect, right? And to me, when I got this several hundred times, at some point, I started really thinking about it. Like, what is it that's making people feel like they can't pick up a violin now? Like, sometimes this would be young people approaching me in their like 20s. Sometimes, yeah, it was 50s, 60s. But the same question. And I was like, so someone, all of these people feel like music's not accessible to them. Okay. Beyond that, they feel, of course, that violin is not. And I respect that because violin is, promoted as one of the more difficult instruments to learn. I do get it. I was fortunate in that I started playing violin when I was young. So it's different for me than it is for adults wanting to learn. But it's all just belief. You can go pick up a violin, and if you persist, if you believe that you can achieve whatever you want to do, you can do it. Like, so what's stopping them is really just a belief system, but we are all connected to music. Music is part of us. Like, just let yourself do it. The number one thing I got from people, that's what it was. And it blew me away. It really did.
That reminds me of that book, The War of Art.
Mm,
Yeah,
mhm,
or that just talks about resistance being the issue, that
mhm.
you come up against something that I think that resistance is just, it's maybe a little laziness, but it also might be a realization of you only have so much time. So maybe it's not how people are realizing it, but deep down, there's something in you that says you could do this, but do you have time to do it and do the other things you want to do too? Like, let's prioritize, what do you want to do the most? And I
Right.
think that's probably part of what causes humanity to put themselves in the little boxes, to reduce themselves down to the things, because it's that realization that time and priority, and this is what you have to do. And if you finished life and you just did the very little bit of everything, and you never got deep into anything, then would that be worth it? Or would you look back on it and say, I wish I did that more. I wish I did that more. I mean,
Right.
I've tried to play violin in my adult life, and I learned one thing, that it's better if you don't have neighbors, and you have to rosin the bow. You have to rosin the bow.
You do.
Do not try to play without the bow appropriately rosined. But it's,
Yeah, like I hear you on that, because you bring up a very important practical point, which is that we do a lot of the time look at it from the lens of time and priorities. And those are important. Those are things that I think about a lot. That's an area that I struggle with, trying to determine my priorities, especially when I identify in so many like multidisciplinary capacities. It is difficult for me to understand what a priority would be or means for me myself. So I get it completely. I think what I would think of though next to evolve this conversation is, it's like, if you don't even try, that's the thing. It's like, if you have this dream to play violin, and by the way, you coming up to me after a show, whoever you are, I can tell that you have a dream because you communicated this to me. You went out of your way to come up on stage and speak to me. And I feel it from what you're saying, right? So I know it's there. Don't pretend it's not. It's when we repress the dreams and we don't even try. That's when I start to take issue conceptually with people saying like, oh, I don't have enough time, oh, my priorities are this. Like, yes, that's true, but also what's not true about what you're saying? How are you using that as an excuse system to not at least try? If you try it and you learn it's not right for you or whatever, okay, but wouldn't you at least draw enough gratification from the sheer act alone of allowing yourself to do something that you felt like you couldn't do? That's what I wonder.
hmm. I wonder if in being more focused on a specific modality, that you can get really good at it,
Mhm.
and then you can see kind of the base programming, for lack of a better word of describing it, of
Mhm.
something, and then you can transfer that over to anything else. Like,
Ooh.
if you really understand painting, then you can identify that emotion, the emotional connection with something else. So if you're really good at painting and you understand it, then maybe you could put that into words and be a poet. Maybe you could put that into words and write music, or all of those things. If all of creativity is connected, like it's from this entity that is the same, and you pick little pieces that you can identify with, so different routes into that creativity, but understanding that the route in is the route in, and now you have access to all of it.
Yeah.
That maybe the point of humanity then, or one of the points of humanity, is to try to get really good at something, to really observe, to really be present, so you
Mm,
can break through that understanding and then go, oh, okay, like musical theory.
yeah.
You could just play a piano and not really understand it, but at some point you get to it where you go, well, this key is connected with this one, and this is with this one, and this pattern repeats, and then you see all those different ways that a stringed instrument is connected, and you go, oh, wait a minute, a piano is just a harp, and maybe I could play a harp, maybe I could play a guitar, maybe I could do these other things.
Yes.
So
I think so.
that's
I
interesting.
think, yeah, it's extremely interesting. I think the interconnectivity that you're talking about is very true. Like, I think it's all transferable. I would want to ask you, because I'm very curious, when you say good, how would you define that?
Good as in like get good at something, or good as in good and evil?
Good as in how you get good at something in the way that you were talking about.
I think you can be good at things and not understand that all connecting base programming of it. Like, I can play the guitar good enough for me to be happy with it, but not good enough to be a concert guitarist or to pick out notes and chords when I listen to other music. Like I could repeat it if you gave me enough time, but it's not like a sound engineer listens to music. I think they're so much into the being able to layer it that it might ruin the way I think of listening to music, because it would be like, oh, I hear this thing all the time and I don't like that. I'd like to fix it. And you could have the same thing with painting, to where you can look at a picture and go, I like that picture. It resonates with me. And then somebody come along and explain, well, there's actually 3 focal points in this painting. And then you see it and you go, oh no, now I'm never going to be able to look at paintings again. For me, I can remember it with music, and I, looking back on it, I can remember the feeling, but I couldn't put it into words now of what the difference is and why I feel that way. But growing up, listened to hard rock, heavy metal type stuff. So Guns N' Roses, things like that. And then I remember the first time I heard Nirvana, and something in my head was like, oh no, I'm not going to be able to listen to Guns N' Roses anymore, because now there's this out here.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people of that same time felt the same way about it. But right now I can listen to both. But right then I couldn't, because I was just, I don't know how to explain it. But to explain what good is, I think it depends on the situation. It's less than perfect. So I think there's people with understandings that are far past me on many different things. But then you look at your life and you go, well, what could I say that I stand apart in from not just general society, but the peers in that group? So I think for me, I'm getting better at writing. I don't think I'm an excellent writer yet, but I'm getting better at it. In poetry, I'm to the point where I understand it's bigger than me, to where I think I can get better, but it's also more of a better of just being able to receive it and function as the antenna of whatever that creativity is. So, and then in regular life, I would say probably policing is the thing that, if somebody said, what do you think you're better at than most people? Or what are you happy about your ability in? What have you put more time in? And that is policing. And I don't do that anymore, but what a great job. It's the most fulfilling job I've ever had. And I like writing. Writing's a great job because you can do it anywhere, but I was still writing when I was policing. But as far as putting time in to try to get good, I think that would be it. And maybe you could look at some sports and say, I tried to do my best at this, but then other things happened and I just continued off to something else. I didn't become a professional soccer player, but I don't know. What do you define good as?
Well, I appreciate you saying all of that, because I think you said some really important stuff for people to consider. And I did kind of hear 2 parts of how you explored that, by which I mean, one part could kind of be like you develop this certain skill set and or proficiency and or understanding within a certain domain. So that's like one piece of what good could obviously mean. And then another piece could be more so the outward looking that you described. You made a few comparisons to like other people in kind of implicit ways in what you said. And I think that I'm glad that we're talking about this, because I hoped the conversation would go here at some point. I think that one of the things that really inhibits people from identifying as creative or pursuing creative modalities is because they're more so in the category of the comparison to other people as a means of determining what's good. And I think that that's normal. And I don't want to ever, in anything that I say, I don't ever want to demonize that, because I think it's impossible to not compare ourselves to other people. It's literally impossible, because we live in a collective, right? And in fact, we derive inspiration and motivation from looking to other people. It's just when it becomes too much of the locus of our attention to say that that's what good means, that's when it becomes a problem. And that's when I think people become inhibited from pursuing or continuing to pursue something creative. So I will say that to me, I think what good really means importantly when it comes to creativity, most importantly, is resonance with yourself and resonance within yourself, alignment within yourself. That's what in this moment with you right now, that's what I'm going to define good as. Am I pursuing something and I am expressing or fulfilling or pursuing whatever that thing in a way that feels authentically right to me right now? And then I would argue that that's good, right? Because I think that people think that that's not enough. It's like I have to have written a certain number of words on this day. I have to have gotten into that gallery. I have to have submitted work to a publication and they're going to accept me. That's when I'm good. That's how I know I'm good. But all of that is based on an outward looking. It's based on a comparative aspect. And the thing that I really want to drive home here is that the very nature of creativity is that everyone is different. And that's hard for people to accept because we live in a world where it's like you use comparison as the basis for understanding who you are. So if my painting is not as good as this painting that's gotten thousands of likes on Instagram, that means that I can't be good, right? No, it doesn't have to mean that. And it doesn't have to mean that in a way that I'm denying reality. It could just be that in my authentic self, I know that I'm good because I know that I'm doing exactly what I need to do for myself. I know I'm learning all the time. I know I'm expressing what I want to express. If it's not received a certain way, okay, let's see how the next piece goes. Right? So to me, that's what I want hopefully people to kind of understand my interpretation of. It's like good shouldn't be a barrier to creativity. And guess what? If you want that audience recognition, if you want that proficiency, you have to be comfortable with being in that messy process. But I hope that you'll allow yourself to feel good by yourself while you're progressing to that level that you want to be at.
Yeah, I think that's the advantage of when you're doing any creative thing,
Mhm.
which maybe you could say is anything, that you feel that connection with something, whether you think it's within yourself or outside of yourself, however you
Right.
define it,
Mhm.
that where you're writing and you're like, oh, this is writing itself, or you're playing something and you're like, oh, that sounds really good. I like that.
Mhm.
That there's so much excellent art out there that the masses will never know.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yep.
That it's a lot of it is luck and or whatever else you want to call it,
Yep.
luck, opportunity, whatever. It's that I think that's why every individual can do it
Yep.
is because you're going to get the fulfillment out of it. And when I look at some writing that I've done and I can come back to it and go, wow, that's pretty good. I'm liking that. That it doesn't matter what anybody else says. I know what I'm feeling about it right then. And oftentimes other people look at it and go, I don't understand that. And you go, well, that's okay. How
Right.
could you?
Right. Right. And I think what you're saying, that brings up a really important point for me, which is it's the act of showing up, right? So showing up can look different to different people at different times in their lives, and that's totally okay. But you made reference to the idea of like sometimes it's like luck or whatever you said about that. And the things that are outside our control shouldn't be allowed to control us. What we can control is the disciplinary nature of how we show up for ourselves in whatever practice we're doing. That's what we can control. So maybe I post a million pictures on Instagram and one of them takes off. Guess what? That wouldn't have taken off unless I showed up because I wanted to
Mhm.
show up, right? People just have this idea that like, oh, like it's luck or like, you never know. So like, why bother? And we truly believe that. Like, why bother? This success is for this kind of person or whatever. If you show up, it will happen for you. You just don't know how, you don't know when, you don't know what it's going to look like, but I encourage you to cultivate a practice of like showing up. Whatever that means for you authentically and to believe that it's good. It's good for you to show up. because whatever else is just going to happen when it's going to happen.
Yeah. You could get lucky and have a best-selling book, but it's going to help if you write a book. You have a better chance of being lucky with it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. What's the best way for people to follow your work?
Well,
Do
I
you have
will. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I will say that I'm currently doing a bit of a TikTok challenge, by which I mean I'm new on TikTok, but I speak about creativity every day. I offer creative perspectives as well as perspectives that are much more about creativity itself. And so I will give you my handle for that, but it's enlightened if anyone would like to look me up just from that. But I will also provide a website link to you when this goes live, because my website is being worked on right now, but that will hopefully be good to go at that point. So TikTok is a great way to reach me though. My website's good. You can also find me on Instagram. I'll provide the handle for that. So that would be 3 great ways to get in touch with me.
All right. And I'll put those in the show notes then so people can connect directly with that.
Perfect.
It's a great conversation. I'm sure it could go on for a lot longer,
Yes.
but there's a lot to digest. So, any thoughts in closing?
And I hear you on that. Like this has been a beautiful experience for me. So thank you very sincerely.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed it. And it is a lot to digest for me and for anyone listening. So that rings true. I think that in conclusion, maybe I would just want to say that as trite as it might sound, I believe in you. Whoever's listening to this right now, I believe in you. And I believe in your ability to create anything that you want for yourself, whether that means you're working towards a certain goal, whether that means you feel stuck in some way and you're not sure what to do about it, whether that means you know that you're meant for something, like in your core, you feel like you're meant for something different than what you're doing and you don't know how to get there. I believe in you. And I believe that sometimes what we really just need is a different framing for something, And so, what I would offer you in this moment is a belief for you to just try on, which is that you are deeply creative. By being alive, you are a creative person. And if you can start to try to take that in to see if it feels right for you, the more that you think about it, what could that open up for you? Like what could that motivate you to see differently about your life? What could that open up for you as something to try? Picking up a pencil and doing a sketch on a page, or maybe you do pick up the violin. I don't know what it is, right? Because everybody's different. But I would tell you that I sincerely believe that you're creative. You can find the evidence in all of the things that you've created, whether that means that you have a son or daughter that you've created, whether that means that you've done a project at work recently that you were proud of. You are creative. And the more that you can believe that about yourself, the more that might be opened up for you. So that's what I would say.
Pretty great. Thank you very much for your time. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. And it's been enlightening.
Yes, it has. Thank you so much.
All right.